Asheville's public school teachers and staff are in an existential battle for greater pay. That fight is also happening with pre-K education and childcare, where wages are often comparable to the fast food industry. Throughout Buncombe County, a coalition of learning centers, nonprofit advocacy groups, and business interests is hoping to influence funding controlled by regional and state officials.
We understand that childcare is the workforce behind the workforce. We know that for parents to be able to be in the workforce, they need quality childcare, they need affordable childcare, and the wages in childcare are just not where they need to be to attract and retain qualified, educated professionals.
I'm Matt Peiken, and this is The Overlook, a daily podcast about the news, arts, issues, and trends of Asheville, North Carolina. Today on The Overlook, I speak with Marcia Whitney, President and CEO of Verner Center for Early Learning, and Greg Borom, Director of Advocacy of Children First Communities and Schools of Buncombe County. We talk about the alarm they're sounding, their call for extending the boost in funding that happened during the pandemic, and the disparities they see around access to quality early childhood education and care. You already know The Overlook brings you stories and voices from across the city. Now we also bring you First Look. It's a new daily newsletter that brings you the news headlines from all over Asheville. You can scan it at a glance and see if there's something you've missed or just need to know more about. No ads disguised as stories, just the headlines in a quick, easy read. Get the First Look newsletter for free at podavl.com/newsletter. I started the conversation by asking Greg Borom about the mission and details of the work of Children First.
Our programs that we run focus on elementary and intermediate schools in Buncombe County. We've had some mergers and name changes over the years, and right now we are a part of the Communities in Schools Network, which is the nation's largest dropout prevention initiative and school success. And so we're part of several organizations in the state that provide the Communities in Schools model of providing a direct support staff in local schools and partnerships with those school systems and doing after-school programs. And we continue to do our public policy advocacy work because we understand that there's direct services that meet the immediate needs of families and children, and then there's the systemic and policy work that's really going to help shape the future and change the landscape long term.
When you're talking about dropout prevention among kids that age, middle school or elementary school, I didn't know that was even an issue. Is dropout an issue at that age, and what contributes to that?
We're really looking at the continuum of success for children, and we know that what happens in early childhood, especially in the first 2,000 days, and in North Carolina, we've really expanded the definition of early childhood to be birth through age 8, so early elementary. It really lays a foundation for a child's emotional health and educational success long term. Our work, again, the model in other places has staff in high schools. The way we've done it here in Buncombe County is really to start in the elementary schools and intermediate schools. It was just a place that we were already working with after-school programs, and we know that what happens there, how kids are doing on those third grade tests, how they're transitioning from elementary school into middle is really going to set the stage for, are they going to graduate? Are they going to stay in school long term? And so there are other partnerships in our community. We're blessed with an abundance of children, youth-focused nonprofits. So there's other groups that are focusing on higher ages, but our work is really centered on being that support and resourcing early on.
Funding is what brought you to, and others who are in your coalition, to speak about state and federal funding. Pre-pandemic, was there adequate funding? And adequate is a subjective term. But was this as prescient of an issue, Marcia, before the pandemic?
Early education and childcare have never been adequately funded, in my humble opinion. If early education was funded at the same levels that K-12 education and higher education were funded, we would have a completely different early education landscape. So that, for me, is really, even before the pandemic, childcare was in crisis and did not have adequate funding because parents are paying too much to have their child in care. teachers are not making enough money, and I literally have colleagues who have lived experiencing homelessness, actively working full-time as an early educator, 7 times more likely to be living in poverty than a K-12 educator. And so the compensation's never been the same, and the missing piece is public investment.
You said that if it were funded at the same level as elementary school and high school, we wouldn't be in this situation. Yet public schools are crying for funding. So that really speaks to where you're at and your colleague organizations are at. So where does this funding go, in a sense? I think of childcare. Isn't that something that is privately paid for? I didn't know there was subsidized childcare. Is there a long history of federal and state subsidized childcare?
Yes, and you have heard of the Head Start program and the Early Head Start program. Maybe Greg's aware of others, but those are the 2 biggest publicly funded access points for early education for kiddos. So Early Head Start is 0 to 3, Head Start is 3 to 5. And we've got so many people who would not be able to access early education at all, would not be able to work outside of the home at all, wouldn't be able to continue their education at all if they didn't have some place to put their child that they knew was going to help that child to be growing and be in a high quality environment.
Greg, what have you seen that's changed that brought this issue to children's first frontal lobe, I guess, in terms of an advocacy issue? What has changed from the pandemic and since? What has changed from your landscape, your vantage?
As Marcia said, we've never seen the investment we've needed in our early childhood financing system, the way we compensate, the way we provide access. And what has changed since the pandemic is that has only grown even into more what I would say is a crisis. And I don't like to use that term lightly, but I think it really does apply here. We understand that childcare is the workforce behind the workforce. We know that for parents to be able to be in the workforce, they need quality childcare, they need affordable childcare. And as Marcia pointed out, the wages in childcare are just not where they need to be to attract and retain qualified, educated professionals, which they are. I think that there's a misconception, especially for folks who are either older and had kids a long time ago or who don't have kids and are actively looking, that the expense of childcare can be that of greater than or equal to the cost of a 4-year public institution. And so it's a real financial burden on families. And even with the programs like Head Start and Early Head Start and our childcare subsidy program, those are the 3 kind of public investments in it that help address affordability. Parents are still paying the bulk of expense across the state. And what we saw in the pandemic was that childcare centers were not able to stay open without this infusion of federal subsidy assistance. As that program progressed through the pandemic, it turned into a program to provide compensation support to teachers and really increase average wages across the state significantly. Before the pandemic, North Carolina was an average wage for a child care teacher of about $12 an hour. And these compensation grants, Marcia can speak to what her center has done with them, but they really, in terms of the study, we've seen wages bumped about $3 or more on average across the state. When those expire at the end of this year, there's no backstop. And that's really where we're at right now, is trying to get the state legislature to continue those grants, because everyone's seen the ads as you drive by fast food restaurants that they're hiring at well over $12 an hour. And so if we all of a sudden drop childcare providers back to a $12 an hour average, we feel, and the data and the surveys show, that there's going to be another exodus of childcare teachers. And that's really the dynamic of the COVID pandemic, is we saw a rush to invest in it. It became a top-line issue on everybody's talking point. Politicians, business leaders, parents, hospital systems were all talking about, we've got to have childcare, and there was that investment. But now, as we're coming out of the pandemic, we're really concerned that that recognition of how important it is and how expensive it is to do right may fade away.
One of the things that comes to my mind when you speak to this, that because the pandemic happened, you suddenly saw this infusion of money that brought wages up to I guess, a respectable level, or at least more than what had been. So you can understand on a certain level, legislators across the spectrum of spending that came with the pandemic, they're saying, look, the pandemic is, quote, over. We need to go back to business as usual, put the people's money back to the people, and stop living off the government. You can hear Republican talking points around this. I'm wondering, if there were no pandemic, and this is just pure conjecture, how do you respond to charges that if it weren't for the pandemic, you wouldn't have had that money anyway?
Using a Verner example of what the compensation increases have meant for us will help to answer that question. Before the pandemic, Verner was able to compensate our lowest base assistant teacher at $13.15 an hour. The pandemic supports, the stabilization grant funding allowed us to bring that rate to $15 an hour, as our living wage in Buncombe County is $20.10. So it is impossible, even with stabilization grant support, our colleagues were not able to make ends meet unless they happen to have other life circumstances, a spouse, a family, that allowed them to be able to afford to be in this field, to say nothing of the exposure to diseases and risk and all the concerns that came with that. And the K-12 system, our teachers, I'm not going to get the numbers quite right, but you're at least in the low 20s as an hourly equivalent starting rate. So that's that gap that I'm talking about between early education and our K-12 system. And the K-12 system has that funding level because they have ongoing, continual, committed public support. And the stabilization grant fundings has always been temporary, a little extension, temporary, a little extension. And I'm right now in the process of asking our board to approve a budget that doesn't include stabilization grant funding, and it's not pretty.
From what I understand, K-12 education is paid for from this nexus of federal funding, state funding, and municipal funding. At least here, from what I understand, the state sets a, quote, starting salary for teachers, and then municipalities have the option of supplemental pay on top of it. Buncombe County does that, and I know that's a big point of contention right now. I just had a couple of people from the teachers union sitting right in the chairs you're in telling me about the fight they're in. Talk about how does that nexus of funding differ, or how is it similar and how is it different for pre-K?
In my opinion, we're not funding education at the levels we should be from bottom to top. I'm a big fan of education. Obviously, our organization is as well. When we look at the public school system and the way we fund that, we are really funding what I would call a true system in that case. And that is...
You said a true system?
System, in that it is a publicly held system. We as the citizens, these are public institutions. It's our tax dollars that are going into them. There's buildings that you drive by and you can see. It's open to all. Obviously, there's the issues of whether it's funding and serving everyone. It's a system not without its problems, but it is truly a public system. When we talk about the early childhood landscape, a lot of people say the early childhood system, and I think that's not quite the same analogy, because unlike the public schools, we don't have this realm of public early childhood centers. It is a blend of private nonprofits, it's a blend of for-profit organizations, businesses working in that space. It's centers in church-based locations. It is family childcare homes licensed as well. And so it's this blend of kind of a choose-your-own-adventure that's not the equivalent when we go into the public school system, right? And so what we have really is a series of funding streams that go into that space. And Marcia noted Head Start and Early Head Start, which is federal, and that's a very long-term model. It's got its regulations and it's got its income eligibility and how it's run. And you have to be true to that model as an Early Head Start or Head Start site. And then you have the Child Care Subsidy Program, which is a federal state match of funding. So the federal government gives a block grant to states, have to contribute some to match, and then they're not limited on how much more they could put into that. That's the program that provides the child care voucher, which is another income eligible way for families to access care. you do have to have a copay. It's not free childcare. So to qualify for a voucher, it's an income threshold. You pay 10% of your income towards the care, so you are putting in money too. And that's the other place we had that funding. North Carolina does have the NC Pre-K program. So that is a program that North Carolina has created at a state level. It's another income eligible program, and it provides a pre-K experience for children who are income eligible there. And the child care, but the spectrum from like birth to when you start public kindergarten, that's the space where, again, it's like Head Start, early Head Start, private providers, for-profit providers, family child care homes, and then NC Pre-K if you qualify and are eligible for that. And then the rest of it is all private pay. And so that's why, again, it's unlike the public school system where you enroll your child and it's free education. We don't have that equivalent sense of a system in terms of an oversight. It's not like we don't have school boards for early childhood. And so what we have is this landscape of different options and a hodgepodge, a patchwork of funding that goes into it.
Something else that you just mentioned about a distinction between K-12 and pre-K is that we can see schools. We recognize what schools look like. Everybody knows what a school looks like. You're talking about this milieu, this melange of how early learning centers, you have places like Verner Centers for Early Learning, which are you can see what they probably look like schools in that sense. Whereas you're talking about also neighborhood homes and neighborhoods and churches and other facilities where this is happening. So to me, if you don't have a child in there specifically, it's just not as present in your life. Do you think that's a big part of this issue, Marcia?
Probably. But if you do have a child in your life, I can assure you from personal experience, it is panic if you don't have care lined up and you need to have it work outside of the home or if you're continuing your education.
Are you advocating that parents pay a smaller percentage, or at least have the opportunity to pay a smaller percentage of these costs, and that these governmental agencies need to step up and pay a higher percentage than what they were doing before?
In my Marcia Whitney dream world, parents would not have to pay anything for high-quality early education. I realize that is not true in this country, but it's true or close to true in almost every other developed country. Almost any other country that would be considered a developed country, a northern country, whatever phrase you want to use, they are absolutely investing in early care and education. For example, and paid parental leave. They try to make having children attractive and affordable for families who also want to continue employment outside of the home. Or even if they don't, they recognize the importance of those early years, the first 2,000 days of life, the first 5 years of life. 90% of brain development is happening in those first 5 years.
Getting word out about your big event is tricky and challenging. You can boost a post on social media, but gaming the algorithm is guesswork. Broadcast and print outlets totally exaggerate their numbers, and there's no way to verify their audience. But I can tell you exactly the number of people listening to The Overlook and where they're based. Most important, my audience is actively listening. Look, that's you right now paying attention. And you can promote your fundraiser or arts event to other smart, dialed-in Asheville people for as little as $40 an episode. Find out more by going to podavl.com/advertise. Why are we having this struggle here in this country? When you're advocating, when you're lobbying, what do you come up against? You would think everybody who has children, who isn't independently wealthy, has had to use childcare that they've had to pay for and get help with. Where's the resistance? I'm just curious, what are you meeting at the legislative level, the people who control the purse strings? Why is this still an issue?
There are people from a values-based perspective who believe that a woman's place is in the home, so there's therefore no need to have paid care outside of the home. There are also business leaders who understand that early education is the workforce behind the workforce and the backbone of a family having children and also being able to continue on a healthy career trajectory. I don't know if it's how much of it's early, the perspective of how we prioritize individualism in this country. You chose to have children. You're on your own. Figure it out.
So these two things, the quote, the woman's place is in the home raising the kid, and you chose to have children, you figure it out. Are you still hearing those things? Are those active pushbacks?
Not in open spaces that I am hearing, but I'm hearing it in closed spaces. I'm hearing it I wouldn't want to say this on the record, but this is what I'm hearing from the people I know who are making some of these decisions.
You had told me that the Chamber of Commerce, business leaders, they understand the value in this. They want a present workforce. Tell me about the coalition of agencies, people, and populations that are behind the movement you're now undertaking to keep these pandemic-era subsidies going.
We are part of the Western North Carolina Early Childhood Coalition. We bring representatives from childcare centers and family childcare home providers and child-focused organizations, including some of our local Partnership for Children's or Smart Starts that cover an 18 Western County region. And we've been working together now the coalition traces its beginnings about 10 years ago, but our expanded coalition goes back just before the pandemic. We grew, and it's working and looking at it from all pieces of that puzzle. So we talked about that melange of different kind of providers. And so the experience of trying to sustain that model and provide high quality childcare looks a little bit different across the different types of providers we have. We're really lucky that we have folks like Verner, the YWCA, Children Family Resource Center down in Henderson County, Macon Program for Progress, Southwestern Child Development Coalition. I'm going to leave out some because it's just too long of a list to name. And we're also really grateful that our local Asheville Area Chamber of Commerce and especially their Woman Up initiative has really taken this issue on as their key focus this spring. We've been delighted to partner with them on 3 different events, the most recent one held at Verner, to really raise this issue of awareness, understand that our chamber has long-term centered early childhood education and care as a key plank of their legislative agenda. And so they're a real champion in this effort. And I think we need more of that. We need more of the business community talking about why it is so important.
Marcia, I want to backtrack a bit. I was starting to ask this and I got sidetracked on something else we were talking about credentialing. You mentioned about at the Verner Center. I want you to talk about what are the credentials that are necessary to be a provider/teacher at Verner? And is this consistent across the board at these centers that might be in basements somewhere in churches and houses? And if there is an inconsistency, is that part of the problem? Is that in terms of getting others to understand about what quality childcare and early learning means?
To answer the first question about what's the required credentialing, there is only one course that is required to be an early education professional, and that is a course called EDU 119. So you are allowed to be hired by an early education program without that degree, without that class, as long as you're working toward it. That is the base minimum to be able to work with children in a classroom. And Verner is a licensed program. Greg mentioned a wide range of other types of licensed programs. There's also a huge number of people who, out of desperation or out of financial need, are using unlicensed solutions, which may be a neighbor or a family member or parents staggering their work life so that they can cover their child's hours that they need coverage. We have, at Verner, we have everything from people who have entered our classrooms without even starting EDU 119 when they begin, to people who have master's degrees in the field. So it's a wide range. Obviously, we want people who see themselves as professionals, are valued, they see themselves as honored as a professional in this field, but it's really hard to do that with the kind of wages that we're able to offer when I personally, early in my career, would have loved to be an early education professional. As it is, I've taken financial hits in my career as a nonprofit professional. I was not willing to sign up for a life of poverty, and so it's a tough decision to make.
Can you tell us what do your childcare, do you call them teachers, or what's the title you use for them, and what's the pay range?
I call them faculty members because I want them to be seen as professionals in their field. They are teachers, they are educators, all those words are accurate. Pay range at Verner now starts at $15 an hour, and to be honest, among our faculty, I'm not even sure what the upend number is, but it's not significant. It's basically the baseline of what a kindergarten teacher would be paid at a K-12 system.
There's such retention issues in the workforce these days. Younger people aren't sticking around in jobs as long. Is retention an issue just because younger people are they're not wanting to step into jobs that even pay at what you're seeking to have paid, and they aren't sticking around long enough for you to grow staff? Is that a real issue?
It definitely has been an issue, and especially with the national hiring crisis that's been going on since the pandemic, not just in early education, but in many other low-wage fields. In many cases, it is more economically feasible for a family to stay home and care for their small child than it is for that family to get a job outside of the home that pays less than what they'd have to pay for care for their own child.
And you can see where the ripple effect of this would be. Not knocking staying home with your children, but that takes somebody out of the workforce, which hurts the economy, hurts employers. That there's just a full cycle that doesn't get fulfilled when we're taking people out of the workforce because they can't afford to work.
Correct.
So are there specific numbers that you're seeking, at least at a state level? I know you can't affect federal legislation and federal dollars. It's hard enough to affect things in Raleigh. But what are you seeking? Are there specific numbers and funding levels you're asking for?
Yes, the gold standard that we'd like to see for investment in the extending the child care teacher compensation grant program would be $300 million in this upcoming budget. They're working on their 2-year biennium budget, and $300 million by most advocates' estimations would really help us keep those wages going through that 2-year budget cycle and give advocates, policymakers, business leaders that 2 years to really come together and say, okay, this is a critical need. It's really an infrastructure investment at the end of the day.
Would this $300 million, in a sense, be a buying time budget? Like, you're not looking necessarily for a market increase in funding. This would be like keeping the way things are now and establishing, so you can use this 2 years to establish a more permanent guideline or structure for funding. Is that accurate?
That's true. We're really at a place where we can't lose capacity. We can't lose teachers right now. Marcia mentioned unlicensed care arrangements. That is the majority of places that our young children are in Buncombe County and Western counties across the state. And looking at numbers from 2019 survey, the cost of infant center-based care on an average in North Carolina was $9,254 for a family, compared to back then public four-year university tuition was $7,200. So you're talking about out of the gate, like you save for college, right? You've got 18 years to try to grow that nest egg for a child to go to college, but an infant to come up with that, and I know that for high-quality centers, I think that's even below the mark, Marcia.
Yeah.
And what we're talking about is, without this compensation grant, the research that has been done, surveys of providers, is that what will happen is there'll be a cliff. And it is much harder to try to bring back a center and bring back qualified, educated professional workforce than it is to try to put another 2-year extension on this program, so that we can have the time to really look at, like, how do we invest in this as a public infrastructure, as a public good, as an education investment, as a workforce investment. And it's really going to take, I think, that this is not quick change. I've been working in early childhood advocacy since the mid-1990s around some of these policies, and we still see some of the same pushbacks on, like, it's too expensive and we don't want to raise taxes to do it. We need federal dollars, no doubt. The $840 million that came to North Carolina for these stabilization funds was the biggest investment in early childhood from the federal government that we've seen. And we saw what we can do and rally to do in a crisis. Is going to take us being able to make sure we don't backslide over the next 2 years, because we can't rebuild if we backslide.
Just a technical question. The funding that came during the pandemic and that you're asking for now, would this also cover unlicensed centers?
No, it does not. When we're talking about the funding that's on the table, either through Head Start, Early Head Start, the NC Pre-K program, or the Child Care Subsidy program, that all has to feed into licensed child care centers or licensed family child home.
Thank you for clarifying that. Is there anything that we haven't talked about you think is important for people to know contextually?
I think one thing we haven't specifically touched on that I think about a lot is that the investment in early education is the best return on investment that we as a society can make. For the really conservative estimates of that return on investment, if we invest $1 in early education, we are saving $7 in societal costs over the duration of that young person's lifetime. They're less likely to need special education supports. They're less likely to be incarcerated. They're more likely to graduate high school. They're more likely to have a job and a profession in their life that's going to sustain them.
Public health, I imagine
Correct.
A lot of their health outcomes probably are increased there.
Absolutely.
Greg, anything from Children First that we haven't talked about that you want people to know?
We really know that the biggest impact that this has had through the pandemic and even before is landing on women being able to pursue careers, remain in the workforce. And we did a banner tour with a Childcare for North Carolina banner that we had, taking it around through western counties. The interviews and pictures are on our Instagram and Facebook page, Children First CS Buncombe County. And I think it's really important for folks to go and hear from the voices of childcare providers and of parents that we interviewed, talking about the tough choices that they're having to make to either stay in the workforce or what it means to them to have the care so they can be in the workforce.
Are there any dates people should be keeping an eye on? Is there a date when the legislature has to pass the budget by and that people can make their voices known to the legislature before that point? Anything there?
Yes. The North Carolina budget, our fiscal year begins July 1. Our state is once again not going to have an approved budget ready for the beginning of our fiscal year, which puts all kinds of services, including our school districts, on a big pause and a wait-and-see moment. What we're hearing from our partners is that we would expect there to be a budget maybe by the end of July, maybe even mid-August. It's a who knows thing, but now is the time to call on our budget conferees. In Western North Carolina, I would say the 3 senators that are on that budget conference committee that have shown interest in early childhood issues are Senator Ralph Heiss and Senator Corbin from out west, and then Senator Daniels. And so folks can get online, you can look them up at ncledge.gov. Call them, email them, tell them that we need to invest in this stabilization compensation extension. We need to be thinking about big investments in early childhood, and it matters.
Our new First Look newsletter gives you just a handful of daily headlines from around the local media landscape to get you on your morning. We also have a weekly newsletter devoted to all things The Overlook that hits you every Friday. Both are free and available at podavl.com/newsletter. And please support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/The Overlook Podcast. I want to thank my guests today, Marcia Whitney, President and CEO of Verner Center for Early Learning, and Greg Borom, Director of Advocacy of Children First Communities and Schools of Buncombe County. Today's conversation happened inside the BB Theater in downtown Asheville, which owners Susan and Giles Collard have been so gracious enough to open to me to record my interviews. Our theme music for The Overlook, Maker's Song, comes courtesy of the Asheville band The Resonant Rogues. The Overlook is a production of Podcast Asheville. New episodes are available every Monday through Thursday morning. I'm Matt Peiken, and I'll see you on the next episode of The Overlook.